Hi, thanks for tuning in to my keynote. I'm Ariel Biller, evangelist for ClearML. You can reach me mostly on Twitter and at STMyar, but also Reddit, Facebook, LinkedIn. What are we here to talk about today? Let's deconstruct this title. It's trying to understand what MLOps really is and not just hearing what people trying to explain to us what MLOps is. Actually, my company has a talk trying to explain what MLOps is in this very convention. So you can actually listen to both. They're on different things. We begin with what's MLOps. MLOps is machine learning operations. And when I initially encountered this term, I thought, machine learning operations, that's training, that's validation, right? But no, operations in this sense is operations, what we need in order to make machine learning go, even if it's in production or not. Actually, it's not just machine learning, it's what happens before machine learning, after machine learning, during machine learning, and it's actually not just machine learning, it's probably also data science related projects. So the best definition of MLOps would be AI infrastructure. But this is too general and it actually doesn't ring like something you can sell. But the beginning of MLOps was actually that. The infrastructure needed by a single company, Google, in order to productionalize their machine learning code. This is a seminal paper by D. Scully, and this is a very familiar image that shows what they needed to go through, actually to tackle the technical debts when trying to productionalize machine learning in large scale. And actually, if you've seen this image, you know that you're in a MLOps talk. Well, there's a starter kit, right? There's this image, there's a butterfly effect, strange attractor, Mobius strip, infinite symbol for a process, right? And the formidable quote that states that so-and-so % of machine learning projects fail. No reference, no quote, just this number. Where did it come from? I don't know. But these three, you're in an MLOps talk. What will you hear after these three? Well, it depends what you're trying to be sold, right? Anything can be MLOps if you ask marketing, with a small constraint that this anything has to do with the actual process of putting machine learning in production. Is it pipelines? Is it the model ops? MLOps, we'll hear about it later. CI/CD for ML, the same. Open source, free ebooks, the whole thing. And once you encounter so many things that stand for MLOps, you're beginning to understand that, boy, are we in hype or not, right? But as someone that stood through few hype cycles, why do I care from hype, right? I know what to do. It just takes a lot of time to sift through the signal and the noise. Well, time is someone that has a machine learning model that wants to go into production doesn't have. This person needs to understand what it needs and what is extra on the road to productionalization. Also, even persons that are not trying to deploy models, just trying to train and validate their own process in large scale, because you need large scale today. They need tools and methods, and they would reach to whatever is there, and if it's really just the production, is it okay for them to use, right? So if you're one of these people, this talk is going to be right up your alley, okay? And we begin automatically deconstructing this MLOps with the first thing everybody would ask, MLOps, ops, isn't it just some kind of DevOps? So what's DevOps? In order to understand what's DevOps, we need to make sure we all understand what production is. So production is this complex machinery, code, pipeline, hardware, everything that the business had to serve its function. And if it's not an AI first business or core AI, then the machine learning models are going to be somewhere in the middle, right? Maybe an insignificant piece if you look at it in an untrained eye. So there's a lot going on, and the machine learning is just part of it. And production, and I'm aging myself, to me sounds like a rock concert. A very complicated happening that you need to coordinate, facilitate, and actually make sure that someone's on stage, right? And who's on stage in a production? Well, the bands that we all like to hear about, right? The best bands, scale, something that everyone who does DevOps would care. And deployment, very important, right? Rollouts, A/B, canary, whatnot. There's also, when you're organizing these things, there are bands that you invite because you have to, and that's governance, right? Very important to have them. In a certain sense, there are many other bands. I won't name them. It's just trying to show you that these are all big items that DevOps care about, and they're not just for machine learning. And in order to control them, DevOps is kind of like orchestrated, well-controlled playing with fire. And playing with fire to make these circular things. It's well-developed and stable. But if you ask a DevOps person, can we do machine learning with the same processes? The answer from her would be yes. But if you try and do it, then you notice that sparks start flying. Actually, some of the pieces don't match together. And actually, this is where most of the lectures would say, yeah, and that's why so-and-so percentage fail. But let's understand first what's going on. Okay, the model in production is kind of like a butterfly. It has a life cycle where it starts as something different, and then it metamorphoses into a model in production. So it has a complicated life cycle, and like a butterfly, it has an expiration date. Why an expiration date? We begin with the obvious ones, time-based models, time series-based, where you always have to retrain. But also robust models, like the ones you put in autonomous vehicles, they only serve their function until they encounter something that's not in the train set, some edge case that was not thought about. So when you encounter this and you recognize the fact that your model needs retraining, the process would be, hey, let's figure out what's broken, let's collect the data that facilitates training the model again, training it again, seeing if it worked, and if it worked, getting the new model into production. These are the sparks, and they cause numerous shouting, a lot of times, if you miss out on the opportunity to retrain before stuff really breaks, then you get woken up in the middle of the night to fix it, or to explain what's broken, or to explain how you think it should be fixed. So ML in production, as DevOps would say, would be how to make sure this doesn't happen. Which is a good definition, but it's not a full one. So let's deconstruct that. Let's see what are the minimum requirements. If you have a model in production and you want to prevent this, how do you do it? Well, first you need, as we said, all the DevOps to scalably launch and monitor what's going on in production. That's DevOps. But you need also an automated pipeline. So when you think that you need to launch a new model, you have to retrain it and get it back to production. So, okay, that's okay. What about these edge cases that help you prevent these shouts, right? You need to be able to use the monitoring that DevOps give you to collect edge cases and curate them in order to have better training. So when you decide you need a new model, you also have new data for it. That dictates a very specific kind of monitoring. And lastly, as we said, you need to explain stuff. So explainability is a big word. Also, observability is a big word. I have another big word, provenance, and I think that's the basic big word. So let's explain about it a little bit. But first, this is the big picture. Minimum viable set of features that you need in order to handle machine learning in production, handle all the technical debt is this. All the other stuff is engineering. Now, provenance. is basically know where you came from and where you're going. It means full reproducibility of the process. Everything should be tracked. But more than the tracking, you need to be mindful of the fact that the model in production is just one part of the life cycle. So it doesn't stop. You have to track even while it's on production. These are very large-scale monitorings. You need to be able to affect statistics on them to get what you need. And lastly, it's not trackable if it's not owned. Okay? Every part of the process, since the model starts seeing data, should be owned by a person, and that's basically wrapping up the definition. Reproducible, life cycle tracking, an owned process. Great. But you know, that just shows you that MLOps start before production begins. So people say that MLOps is how to bridge between R&D and production. Let's examine this definition. What do I mean by saying bridge, right? R&D and production are different entities, especially in software 1.0. Normal places where DevOps certainly works is where you have code, you launch it into production, two different entities, very clear line between them. If something breaks in production, you most probably can isolate the cause, do some kind of sandbox to reproduce it in R&D, fix it and launch it again. And this is why DevOps works, right? The point is that when data is in the process, when it's software 2.0, you have a very, very natural looking interface where you don't know where one thing starts and the other begins. If you look at the shoreline where R&D is, you actually know that there's water even when you don't see it, right? Even in the top left edge, there's water. And in the middle between R&D and production, there's uncertainty. You don't know if it's R&D or production. And this uncertainty leads to lots of inventions. For example, the machine learning ops maturity levels, or the MLOps level that you see. And all of them are just saying, we don't need this uncertainty. Since there's a lot of water, there's a lot of production in there, everything is production. So you distort the concept of production, and you're moving the goalpost. Now you have a finer interface between R&D and production, still the same amount of uncertainty, but now production also has to make sure that the automated process of data coming in, curating, and being added into training, deciding when you need to retrain, all of that needs to be live in production. I don't say that's wrong, but this gives rise to a lot of people saying, but how is it possible? You're just moving the goalpost. The research has to be part of the process. You need a smooth transition between R&D and production. And why are they saying it? You know, it's because this water in this picture is data. And data is the model. The model is the data. A lot of times we say 80% of the work is data work because it's true, okay? Data is everywhere, and it will engulf everything you build in order to provide infrastructure. Okay, and going back into this picture, you know, it's very enticing from the marketing sense. You know, I will sell you something that gives you this R&D and production together. This is an origin of a lot of the hype. Okay, but in order to sell something like this, right? You need to fix what you think R&D is and hold constant what you think production is. And this doesn't really apply to lots of cases. So where are we left with in this definition? It's just a definition of the complexity of putting machine learning into production, and a machine learning model encountering the real world. This is not MLOps. Well, let's go back to school. Okay, best practices. Where do we encounter best practices for MLOps? Well, since we have DevOps inside MLOps, they have established best practices that work. Do MLOps have established best practices that work? The answer is no. We saw the sparks flying. Hopefully in the future we'll have something that everybody agrees that works, but now everybody's trying to do their own thing, trying to say my thing works better than the others. nothing works. It's all sparks all the time. It's all shouts. It's all broken. But in the future, we will have to train people to think about addressing these problems before they occur. We have courses for MLOps already, and I wasn't going to name names, but this is a big name to name. Machine Learning Engineering for Productions, MLOps, by Andrew and G, offered by Deep Learning AI in Coursera. It's a big thing to deconstruct. And I'm not criticizing the course. I have not seen the course itself. I'm sure it's very good, but let's see what they're trying to teach you. Okay? Designing machine learning production system end-to-end. That means scoping the project, detailing the data needs, strategies for modeling, algorithms, right? And deployment requirements. Would I need a CPU or a GPU? To me, this sounds like a lot like full stack data science. This is a very complicated task. I'm not sure how to teach it in a specialization, but okay, great. Next, establish a model baseline, address concept drift, and prototype how to develop, deploy, and continuously improve a productionalized machine learning application. This is, by definition, the work of a machine learning engineer. I know the definitions shift around in companies, but this is a very fundamental core of the process, of the job. Likewise, building data pipelines, establishing data lifecycle, and the word that I like, provenance, this is the core of the job for a data engineer. Actually, it's not the core of the job. Data engineer has lots of other roles in the company, and serving the needs of the data scientists and the machine learning engineers is just one of them. But again, this is a big part of MLOps, right? Lastly, applying best practices and progressive delivery techniques to maintain and monitor. Didn't I just say this is DevOps? It is. So, according to Deep Learning AI, the things you need to know in order to do MLOps are the basic, at least the basic roles of data science, machine learning, data engineering, and DevOps. Okay? That's a whole lot of things to learn, right? It just stands to show you that each and every one of them has a different definition for what MLOps is. So this is the root of the problem that I need to deconstruct. I need to show that all of them are coming from a single definition that is universal. And these are the roles, okay? I'm not trying to make any joke, but I try to find the least offensive images for all of them. Especially the machine learning engineer is playing with fire unresponsibly, and the DevOps is playing with fire responsibly. Come at me, right? Anyhow, so each and every one of them sees a different MLOps. Can we define a single one? Should we, okay? Should we offer MLOps as the bridge between different roles? And in order to answer these questions, I have to go a couple of thousand years into the past. There is an ancient parable, okay, about blind monks trying to describe what an elephant is. An elephant is a big creature, so naturally each of them can only interface with a part of the elephant. So one would say it's a very scary monster with sharp teeth. The other one would say it's a funny monster with a wavy hair, and so on and so forth, right? You know this. And this is called anikantavada in Jainism. It means multisidedness. It means we need to understand that in life there are concepts that will always seem different if you look at them from a different direction. And the elephant in the room, in this case, is MLOps. And the blind persons are all the roles in the company. So if you ask 10 data scientists what MLOps is, you'll get, as the saying goes, 11 different answers. More so if you ask other roles in the company, the machine learning engineer, the business stakeholders, whatever, right? So maybe, just maybe, we should hang on to this concept, right? Think about it, okay? If MLOps is exposing different sites to different roles, then the basic thing we need to understand about MLOps is how it supports those roles, not how everybody can agree on one thing. And this is, I think, the take-home message from this lecture, right? You just need to get a certain set of universal language between the roles that they can agree about the basic stuff. Let's talk about this some more. Okay, but before that, I want to hook you back to the image of the shoreline. If we take this Jainist definition for MLOps, then MLOps is the wharf when you get all the roles to tie their boats into when you go from and back and from R&D to production. It actually helps you manage the process. Okay, great. This is a logical definition, so we're not blowing up some pipe dreams here. Okay, as I said, this will allow a basic definition of MLOps. What's basic in this sense? Basic in the sense that when you decide to build or buy a component that has to serve a function for MLOps, each role that you will encounter will say, yes, I need that. This is not something that does not belong to what I do on a daily basis. So let's address that. Okay? Development. Basic concept. This means a lot. Most like top 3 things inside development is experiment management. That means tracking, training, and everything done during R&D. And the development itself, the component of MLOps has to be zero hassle because development is complicated on its own and you can't add another process to govern it. It just means that people will work around the process. And if you want development to be applicable to all roles, development has to include already automations. You can't build something and then plug automations on top of it. You have to think about automation while you're building. Great, that's development. What's next? Storage, metadata and data storage, okay? I know the data engineers will say, yeah, I've got my data lake. That's not this one, okay? This is where you store the data needed to hold reproducibility, the origin of provenance, right? Especially for data sets. Data sets are those things that you gleaned off the large organizational database in order to do the initial training. Sometimes you'd have to go back and say, how did this data look like when I first pulled it off, right? So you need to be able to go back in time to the first instance where you took the data and wrapped it in the concept called the data set. It's not that complicated, but you have to do it. And again, this is something that all the roles would agree on. And lastly, most importantly, storing the metrics, because if the model is there without saying if it's good or not, you can't use it, because then you won't be able to compare it to what happened in production later on. Also, you need to store the stuff from production somewhere. So a storage device that is enabling this meta and data storage is important. Orchestration. Orchestration is a big thing in production, but also in research, as I will show you. This basically means I want to do something, I need to be able to get some hardware to run on, schedule my run, have some kind of priority mechanism where important stuff will run before non-important stuff, and this self-serving ability, and I'm saying it in the best best kind of use for the word. It means that the DevOps person only has to care about provisioning resources for the other roles, and the other roles just have to say, I want to schedule, and the DevOps person doesn't have to allow each one separately. Lastly, as we said, it's machine learning in production, you need serving. Serving is what comes just before deployment, right? And for that, you need to actually be able to locate the model. And locating the model is not enough. You need to be able to connect it to all the metrics and provenance data collected on it. And you need to be able to do it with an external CI/CD trigger. Somebody has to press the button to say launch, right? And from that point onward, you need monitoring. You need to be able to hook up to whatever monitoring you have to collect what you can, to analyze how the model is doing in production. Okay, so why these four? Basically, these are the four that once they are in place, you probably shouldn't try to use some other solution instead. You probably shouldn't tear them down for replacing. You should not refactor them. The other stuff in your organization, they are probably going to be deprecated or deemed as non-modern within months or years, right? So you need to be able to replace them. Think about it like spider building its web. Okay, the spider can't build the web on air. It needs to latch on to things. So it will very patiently choose a place to put his web. And the web will not last forever in the spider sense, right? It's a few days. Always trying to rebuild and reconstruct and work on the web. But around it should be a pretty stable infrastructure of, I don't know, in this case, a tree that stands for these basic components. Okay? So once you agree about how to do serving, how to do orchestration, how to store the data, and how to do development, these will probably stick for a while. The other stuff may be less. Examples. Why are they relevant to all the roles before? Okay, let's look at the data scientist. Okay, the data scientist is trying to come up with the model that will be used. So development is a big ticket item. Inside of that, automations will increase productivity, but also will enable orchestration. Orchestration in the sense of data scientists is two things. One, hyperparameter optimization. You got to go launch 1,000 of experiments and pick the best one. You don't do it on your own laptop, right? That has to happen seamlessly. You have to press a button, send those stuff out, get the results. But also, if you only train on your own box, you're working serially. And most organizations would say, you know, while you're training that, while you're working on that, can you do X? So you need to be able to switch around in context, and for that you need to be able to orchestrate experiments not on your dev box. Of course, metadata store, all the models you create, all the metrics you collect should be stored for further use. And even serving relates to data scientists because maybe you want to run a small example or a sandbox or staging just to see that whatever you developed actually works with real-world data before you go and launch it to production. Okay, so you have used all four universal MLOps elements. But also, a machine learning engineer would use those. Well, the development will be of a different sort, right? We just saw an example when we were discussing MLOps. But there is development, a big emphasis on orchestration, right? But also you need to access the data store. And lastly, you need to coordinate serving. Coordinate is the big key here. We said there are going to be triggers, right? So you, again, used all four items. You can do the same for DevOps, other thing. These are really the basic stuff, and we found them basically in ClearML by discussing with our users. We have a big user base, and we're seeing where they're using stuff, and actually these are the things that they most care about all the time. Okay. And I said the name of the product, ClearML, so basically I'm off the hook in terms of marketing, but I need to actually convince you slightly more about how to get those four basic items. But no, I'm not going to do any salesmen here. It's more important for me to hear what you think about my idea for the basic elements. And here's my handle again. Talk to me. I do have an upcoming webinar in this venue, ODSC, about building and buying. So I would say one thing, okay? As the spider doesn't build the web from scratch, most organizations will not build MLOps from scratch. They will use probably open source projects, okay? But when you do that, you're not just building, you're buying into a methodology, you're buying into a set of practices that the people developed the component believe in. You're also buying into the belief that the product will be updated forever, at least in forever, not in the spider sense of the word, but in the project sense of the word. So there is no true build in MLOps. There's always buy. It's just a certain sense of what you're buying and how much you're paying for in money or in organizational costs. Okay, summary. We've been through quite a ride. I hope I was clear enough for you. We've seen how the minimum viable product or the let's not have shouting definition of MLOps work. We've seen how the Zen definition of interface between R&D and production work. I think I've convinced you that MLOps is not just DevOps for ML. And I hope you're hooked up to the idea that there is not just one definition of MLOps. The only thing to do is to sync between the definitions in an organization. Take-home message, MLOps isn't just one thing. And that just connects back to the beginning. Everything was MLOps after all. So thank you for listening. And I guess we're going to go to the live section right now for questions. I hope it will go smoothly. If not, again, I'm available for questions all the time. That's my email, that's my handle. Don't forget to check out ClearML. 2 slides very fast about our startup. In case you're wondering, you can pause this later. This is how to get in touch with us and do feature requests. Thank you very much.